today we're talking about lessons from a crime boss. And it's interesting yet sad story. God can use all of us. He really can. No matter how good or how bad you are, you find this man, Jephthah. Jephthah is in the book of Hebrews. He's a man of faith. And you go, what kind of a man of faith was Jephthah? He was a crime boss. He actually was a renegade. He had a group of men that followed him. They were worthless men, as the Bible calls them, and yet they did his bidding. And so he probably had some racket going on in Israel, making a lot of money, making a lot of threats, having a lot of power. He was a son of a prostitute, but he also had a dad that was somewhat prominent. He had some half-brothers that didn't like him and kicked him out, and so he made a name for himself. And he became a mighty warrior and a crime boss, a gang leader. This is Jephthah. And it's not one of those Bible stories you talk about, but you realize that God can use all of us no matter what. But some churches have marquees and they put various things out. You probably have seen some of these, but these are silly signs that have been out. I don't know, they just didn't check them before they put them out in the street. And people driving by taking pictures saying, did you see that sign by the church? This is one church sign. It said, Sunday sermon. What is hell? Arrive early and hear our choir. You get, all right, it's coming. All right, there you go. This is another one. Morning sermon. Jesus walks on water. Evening sermon. Searching for Jesus. They lost Jesus in the morning, and I don't know where he is. All right, this was another one, St. Peter's Catholic, and they said their youth group basketball. Come watch us kill Christ the King. I guess that was the opposing church, and that was their name. So that was not so good. This is the worst. I know they really should check this. It said, join our new tithing campaign. Our pastor has upped his pledge. Up yours. Yeah. Not good. It's amazing that God can use all of us no matter what. God can use our church signs. God can use people who do whatever. And God can use all of us. And today we're just talking about how God can use all of us. Back in 2002, I don't know if you saw this movie, Catch Me If You Can. Anyone remember that? Catch Me If You Can. It was a movie about a true story of a guy who just pretended to be a lot of things, not everything, but he was able to look like a pilot, and he also pretended to be a doctor, and also pretended to be a lawyer. And he also had the ability of taking checks and signing them and putting little decals on there and making large withdrawals from his bank account that had no money. And finally they caught him, but he changed his name and opened different accounts and kept withdrawing money. And he would hop from place to place, and he would pretend to be an airline pilot. And that back then he didn't have to fly the plane, but he was just like, I'm off duty, but can I get a free flight? He flew all over the country for free. He was a lawyer down in Louisiana, and claimed he was from Harvard, got a job, got some paycheck there, until someone from Harvard said, hey, I graduated the same year you did. And then he goes, I got to leave. And he went over and was in Georgia, I think. He pretended to be a doctor there, and he was in charge of interns. Fortunately, he didn't have to do any major surgery, but he just pretended to do all this stuff. Finally, they caught him, and they were going to send him to jail. And on the way to jail, he escaped. And he was making his way up to Canada. And then they caught him again. And they sent him to jail. And he escaped. Finally, the FBI wised up and said, you're pretty good at what you do. How about if you work for us? And so he did. He didn't go to prison. Never did. But he worked for the FBI, showing how people can forge checks, how people can misuse their identity. And he said, this is what I did, and this is what a lot of people do, and this is how you can catch them. And so he taught the FBI a little bit about what he was doing in his life of crime. And in a way, this is what we're looking at with Jephthah. It's just lessons from a crime boss. And chapter 10 starts out without Jephthah in the picture, but there's a few more judges that don't get a whole lot of recognition. Tola, and then there's Jar in verse 5. And it says this in chapter 10, or verse 3. It says, after Tola died, Jar from Gilead judged Israel for 22 years. It doesn't tell us anything about the first judge, Tola, but Jar, we find out in verse 4, his 30 sons rode around on 30 donkeys, and they owned 30 towns in the land of Gilead, which is still called the towns of Jar. When Jar died, he was buried in Canaan. That's it. All we figure out about this judge is that he was wealthy. He had a lot of sons. Obviously, he had probably multiple wives, 30 sons. All of them had donkeys. I mean, they had donkeys back in those days. Were wealthy people had donkeys. Not everyone had a donkey. And so they had all these donkeys riding around, the various styles of donkeys, with the little necklaces around them. So he was wealthy. And that's what he's known for. He had a lot of sons, he had a lot of donkeys, and he had a lot of towns. Did he do any good? Not a whole lot. J. Vernon McGee just talks about this one judge and said, well, he did nothing for God at all. He lived, he died, and was buried. He had nothing. He had a lot of power, but he had no purpose. He had a lot of affluence, but he had no influence. He just lived and then he died. He said, what a sad life. And I think his number one lesson that we can learn from Jephthah and these other judges is that you just live for Jesus. Rick Warren, in his Purpose-Driven Life book, he starts out with a very now famous sentence. It says, it's not about you. It's about God. It's all about God. Our life is not about God making our lives more comfortable. Our relationship with God is not that God is our genie in the bottle and we rub it and he answers all of our prayer requests. God is not a first aid kit that we go to only when we need some medical attention. That's not the God we serve. If you've gone to catechism, perhaps you know the answer. If you don't, this is a good question just to remember. What is the chief end of man? Why are we here? And the question is good, and the answer is even better, and this is what kids have gone through the centuries. If they've gone to any catechism class, it says, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's why we're here. We're here to live for Jesus. Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And so we just need to remember that we're here to glorify God. We're not here to have God make our life more comfortable, although He does sometimes. And He does answer our prayers. And He is concerned about the life that we live. And He does want to bless us. And He loves us. And every good gift comes from God, our Father in heaven. We need to remember that. But we're here to live for Jesus. To make Him known, to glorify Him, to give Him glory in all that we do. And it's not about us. And we just have to get off this selfish mindset that some of us have, myself included, that we always think that God is here for me. He is. But ultimately, we are here for God. We are here to bring Him glory. If you have kids, you go, I love those kids. And sometimes when they do something well, and at the Beyblade, that the little kids were doing, and I find a parent say, hey, you must be proud of your son, your daughter. You go, yeah, I am. In a way, God wants to be proud of us. Yeah, good job. You must be proud of your kids. Yeah. Did you see what they did? Yeah, but have you seen all the mess people say? And Satan's always accusing. Did you see what Jim did? Yeah, but did you see that? That one moment? Did you see that? God's looking at us. And those little slices of faith, He goes, good job. I'm proud of you. I'm excited about that. And so He mentions here, it says here, the gods of Amram, Sidon, Moab, Amnon, and Philistia. All of them. They all have different gods. And you have Baal and Ashtoreth, and you have Chemosh, and all these different gods. And Samuel, the writer here, is just saying, they just turned to any god they wanted. And they just forgot about God and worshipped whatever god they wanted to serve. Today you go, well, we don't serve idols. We don't have a little idol in my living room. I've gone to some places in the world and they do have little idols and they just have little statues and they worship those or think they're some kind of gods and go, we don't do that. Or do we? Someone once said here in America we do have gods, although they're not statues, but we might have a God that gives us power, any God that gives us joy, any God that makes us feel significant. What are those? I don't know. Sometimes it's money. Money becomes a god. Our abilities, our good looks, our good grades, our friends, sex, drugs, entertainment, pleasure, anything that brings us joy. Are those gods in our lives? Anything that God is second place. Anything that puts God aside. I got to go to church. No, you know what? I got to do this first. This is more important. What's more important than God in your life? And people say you just need to watch out for that. God says, I don't want to be second. I want to be first. You got to serve God. And so, verse 7, so the Lord burned with anger against Israel. There are times that we make God angry. There are times His patience, although He is very patient, runs out. I don't want to be there if God's patience runs out on me. I want to serve God and make Him happy and please Him and glorify Him. But it seems like the Israelites didn't. And so the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and He turned them over to the Philistines and the Amorites. There are times God just says, all right, you want your prayers answered? Go ahead. I'll let your prayers be answered, and you can have what you want. And sometimes really what we want is not what we need. Be careful what you ask for. These people didn't want God in their lives at all. I don't want God in my life. I want to serve the other gods. And so God says, okay. Has our country done that? Maybe. We don't want God in our schools. We don't want to talk about God in the media. God says, okay. How about you? Have you said that? Well, obviously not, because you're here in church. Well done. But there are people that just say, I don't want God. And there are times that maybe God will give them what they want. But then the Israelites pleaded with the Lord and said, we've sinned. Their attitudes changed. Now they're not saying, just help me do better, make me healthy, get me out of this mess. Now they just humbly come to God and say, you know what? Punish us as you see fit. We're in your hands. Ruin our lives if you want. You ever pray that? In verse 16, and he was grieved by their misery. He was grieved by their misery. A second lesson is just that we need to relish in the grace of God. There are sometimes we don't understand God's grace. We think we need to earn it. We think if we do this, God will do that. There are times that we just get the grace of God, the goodness of God, the blessings of God, just because He loves us. Do you deserve it? No. Do I deserve it? No. When you got saved, did you earn your salvation? No. It's by the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ that you got saved. Verse 1 of chapter 11. Now Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior. It was very kind. He was a great warrior. He had conquered various villages. He had made himself wealthy. He was certainly imperfect. His history was not great, but it seems like God doesn't matter about our history. Don't stumble over your history. Don't stumble over your background. Gilead obviously had owned up to his mistake and said, well, you know, here's my son from a prostitute, but I'm going to bring him home. He's going to be here, and I'm going to raise him. But then when he died, the son says, you're not getting any of our father's inheritance. You're a half-brother. You're not even part of our family, really. And they kicked him out. They threw him out. It says, for you're the son of a prostitute. So verse 3, so Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him. He just had this band of worthless men following him. He didn't have much of a life, but he made the best that he could. He had some people following him. But you look at a guy's life, and he was the son of a prostitute. No one in his family liked him. His dad was dead, and now his half-brothers kick him out. And so where's he going to go? What's he going to do? What a miserable life. Maybe some of your background's not that great either in your history, but here's something Rick Warren once said, while there are illegitimate parents, there are no illegitimate children. Your birth was no mistake. Your life is no fluke of nature. Your parents may not have planned you, but God did. He was not at all surprised by your birth. In fact, He expected it. And long before you were conceived by your parents, you were conceived in the mind of God. He thought of you first. It is not fate, nor chance, nor luck, nor coincidence that you are breathing at this moment. You're alive because God loves you and wanted to create you. And like Jephthah, you're here today for a reason. There is hope. There's a reason. There's a purpose for your life. And as you look ahead, God says, I can use you because God does use ungodly people. God does use broken people. God does use imperfect people for His glory and for His purpose. And so Jephthah goes, all right. And he had this battle, and he knew his history. He also knew about all the gods that various people worshiped. He had a good idea of various gods, Baal, Asherah, Chemosh. And the third thing we can learn from Jephthah is to be careful of your words. Words matter. Your words matter. You never can take them back. Just don't say what's on your mind, because sometimes what's in your mind's not the best, right? I just say what I'm thinking. No, don't do that. Be careful with your words. Be thoughtful. The Bible says be encouraging with one another. Watch what you say. Jephthah, used to worshiping idols, knows about the God of Israel, knows about the history, but didn't have a whole lot of faith. He said something foolish. And he said this, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. What was he thinking? Well, back then, burnt offerings were normal. Burnt offerings were what the people of Israel had given to Baal and Asherah, and so he just said this without thinking. Sometimes we say things without thinking, and you can't take them back. You can ask for forgiveness. But man, be careful of what you're about to say. Some people have written this. I found this on the internet. Just it says, think before you speak, and some little guidelines from people. This was from an unknown author. It says, be careful of your words. Once they are said, they can only be forgiven and not forgotten. Someone said this, words are free. It's how you use them that will cost you. Just watch what you say. There are so many words in the Bible that really lift us and encourage us and they're just valuable. And then as James says, what comes out of our mouths are just sometimes thoughtless, cruel, emotionally damaging. I often remember about a book I read as I was a dad, and they said dads rarely speak positive things to their kids. Most of the time they're always tearing them down or instructing them, and that's about it. And I go, I don't want to be that kind of dad. I want to say I love you to my kids and try to catch them at doing something that's good and encourage them as much as I can. And I think that's the way we need to treat people too. We tend to talk down to people to make us look better. And maybe we shouldn't make vows at all. In fact, Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no's be no. You don't always have to make bargains. Here's Jephthah. God, I'll do this if you do this for me. And he wasn't very careful with his words. But he was a man that's had some faith. It's written in the book of Hebrews, and you say, where is that? Well, you see verse 13, or 32 of chapter 11, it says, so Jephthah led his army against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave him victory. He crushed the Ammonites, devastating about 20 towns, just completely demolished. In that moment of battle, he said, all right, God, I'm going to step out in faith, lead these Israelites, and they won a great victory. Good for him. Man of faith in that moment. But then he slipped like Gideon, perhaps, with the success and pride of winning, forgetting about who God is. All of a sudden he comes back, and we need to stay balanced, I think. What it says in the Bible, as you read it, it sounds ridiculous. How in the world did he do that? But it says in verse 34, when Jephthah returned home to Mizpah, his daughter came out to meet him, playing on a tambourine and dancing for joy. She was his one and only child. He had no other sons or daughters. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes in anguish. Silly, ridiculous thing that he said. Why do you ever make that kind of promise? He could have been a man of honor and say, I'm not keeping this vow. I don't need to. But back in that culture, his culture had affected him so much, He had to be a man of his word, and he couldn't go back on his word. He could have, but he didn't want to. Culture had just embedded that in him, in his mentality. That's how he built his empire. He had to be a man of his word. If he didn't, other people wouldn't trust him. Maybe he had to make this vow and carry it through because he understood burnt sacrifices were what people did back then if they weren't following Jehovah. God says sacrificing a child is terrible. I don't want you to do that at all. But other people worshiping other gods did. And you read just in chapter 10 that they had all these mishmash of thinking. We have to realize culture affects us whether we think it or not. I mean, you hear about abortion and now you don't blink an eye. Well, someone had an abortion. Oh, it's too bad. John Piper says this, we need to conform not to this world, but we got to be balanced. And how do you be balanced and not letting the culture affect us so much? Don't be conformed to this world. But then how do you balance this? When Paul says later on in 1 Corinthians, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. How is becoming all things to all people not conforming to the culture? How does that work? He goes on, how does the command not to conform to the world relate to this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10? Give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. It says, don't be antagonistic and causing problems. How do you do that when you don't want to conform to the culture and you got to be balanced? How do you do that? How does being conformed to the world fit with not giving offense to the world? You can't have it both ways. You can't. You can't always please people if you refuse to conform to the culture and their thoughts and their ways. And he mentions this. The gospel must be indigenous. We have to be indigenous. We have to fit into the culture. We have to relate to the people so that we can talk about Jesus. Missionaries do that all the time. We have to do that. We have to understand our culture. We have to be indigenous. And yet we also have to have a pilgrim mindset. A pilgrim mindset is that you're taking people out and being a pilgrim and going to a new land, taking people out of the culture and becoming citizens of heaven. So how do we do that? How do we stay balanced? Jephthah had to be balanced. He says, I made a vow, and I know vows are important, to give my daughter as a burnt sacrifice. What do I do? Well, he had no question. He fulfilled the vow that he made. John Piper says this, confrontation of the world, yes, but we also have to be like a missionary and adapt to the culture that you're in. Be balanced. You have to separate yourself from the world, but also have to be culturally participating in it. You have to be not of the world, but yes, you have to be in the world. No, you can't conform to the world, but you have to become all things to all people so that by some way they would get saved. Just be balanced in what you're doing. And Jephthah, he didn't. As I read it, it seems like the word and the flow of the words just show that he did this terrible thing. But the point is, stay balanced in your life. Use your words carefully. And lastly, spend time pursuing unity and overlooking insults. After he did that, the whole chapter of 12 is just he's insulted by some people of his own tribe. There was a tribe of Ephraim that were upset about Gideon's victory, and now they come and say, dude, what are you doing? Why didn't you call us to help fight? They always came a little late. Tribe of Ephraim, they never were in the battle. They just came a little late and said, hey, how come you didn't let us get in on the party? And here, he's just looking at them and he's just insulted by them. So what's he do? He says, they go up to Jephthah and he says, we're going to burn down your house. We're going to kill you and burn down your house. So Jephthah, and perhaps rightly so, but he needed to work a little better on his diplomatic side now. He did all right earlier with the leaders of Israel, and he tried with the enemy, but now his own people are coming, and he's getting angry, and he's been insulted. So Jephthah says, I summon you at the beginning of this dispute, but you refused to come. You failed to help us in our struggle. So when I realized you weren't coming, I risked my life and went to battle without you, and the Lord gave me victory over the Ammonites. So why have you come now to fight me? And then verse 4, the people of Ephraim responded, "You men of Gilead are nothing more than fugitives." He knew Jephthah's background from Ephraim and Manasseh. So Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead, and how he settled this dispute, he just smacked them across the face. He just attacked them and defeated them. He killed them. He just attacked them and said, "I'm so tired of all this." Maybe he's upset because he had to kill his daughter. Maybe he's upset, whatever, but he couldn't overlook insults. They insulted him, his leadership ability, and so he just went and killed them. He probably killed a lot of innocent people too, because these men that came, maybe he had a beef with them and he could have done a little better. But then he started to fight against the whole tribe, and people are in disarray, and the whole country's falling apart. And Ephraimites had this accent, and they couldn't say Jephthah. They couldn't say it. I can't even say it, but they couldn't say it. And so as they're trying to escape across the Jordan River, they had this little place, and everyone that came from Ephraim trying to escape, they said, "Say Jephthah." And if they couldn't say it, "Oh, you said it wrong," and they kill him. You go, "Jephthah, what are you doing?" And he just got out of control. And you see at the end of chapter 12, 42,000 Ephraimites were killed. Just because of a little argument, he didn't overlook the insults. There are sometimes we just need to look over some of the insults that we have, realize that we are here by the grace of God, be careful of our words, and watch our actions. Just say, "You know what? I want to pursue unity in my family, unity at work, unity with my friends. I'm not going to get all upset. I'm not going to be easily offended." You know what Paul said in chapter 13, Corinthians, it says that love is not easily angered. Hopefully you're not that person that people have to walk around like walking on eggshells, because you get so angry so easily. No, love is just not easily offended. You don't get angry easily. You overlook insults and you go, "I'm not going to act like Jephthah. I'm not going to do that." Tim Keller said, "If we did this, life in churches would be more loving and appealing to the lost." Are you one to quickly judge others? And do you fail at times to forgive? We just need to learn our lesson and learn our lessons well. As we go through life, you just say, "You know what, God, you use imperfect people all the time. He used Jephthah, He used Gideon, He used Barak, He used me, He uses you. We're not perfect. We're not. But yet God says, I can use you, live by faith, walk by faith, and God can continue to do His will here on earth using all of us imperfect people to glorify Him. We're not perfect. We're striving to be perfect. We're striving to know God more. We're striving to be more like His Son Jesus, allowing God to permeate our thoughts, that we don't conform to the culture of this world, but we're being balanced, that we just do it all and say, God, I want to let you use me. I want to let you use me. As I said earlier, this is what Warren Wiersbe said, and hopefully whatever your past is like, and that Jephthah's past was not the best, yet God still used him, that we will be used by God. God doesn't want us to ignore the past. The past should be a rudder to guide us, not an anchor to hold us back. Don't hold back saying, you know, my past is not the greatest. God can't use me. Yes, He can. He used Jephthah, He used Gideon, He used Barak, He can use you, He can use me. You never know what God can do. Our past doesn't keep us back from being used by God. And say, God, use me. And remember the lessons from a crime boss named Jephthah. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this time.